Well, we're going to talk about AM4 and AM5 compatibility today because there are some things that I didn't even realize. I mean, I kind of did, but didn't until actually watching Der Bauer's video about the delidding tool and direct die cooling kit that he has been developing, which, by the way, we will be doing a video about. I'm really excited about that. I'll put a link to Der Bauer's video down below. I think you guys should go and check it out if you're interested about direct die cooling and some things that we kind of thought about AM5's temperatures, and it's all kind of coming to light now. So let's talk about the sort of ugly truth about AM4's compatibility with AM5 and why the temperatures are so damn high. Due to its AMD Ryzen 6000 series processor, IPS QHD+ 240Hz screen, and RX 6800M discrete graphics, the Voyager A1600 from Corsair is a no-compromise mobile computing powerhouse. Voyager also features Slipstream wireless integration for Corsair Slipstream devices, Cherry MX mechanical keys with Capellix per-key RGB programming, and integrated Stream Deck software. The Voyager A1600 from Corsair changes the way you do mobile gaming and creation. To see the complete feature list, follow the sponsored link in the description below. Not LTT store screwdriver. I'm actually not intentionally not using it. It's just like I said, I have my preferred tool. It's this ugly $10 one from Amazon that you can't even buy anymore. It's the Sledgehammer or whatever it's called. It's called Warhammer. Hammerhead. I can't remember. I'm going to take this cooler off. This is an AM4 AIO. But there's a little bit more to the story than just does it have AM4 mountings? Because I prefer these mounts, by the way, which have the, as you can see, I had the screws that kind of go through the hole. But what you'll notice about this particular cooler, also gives me a chance to sort of inspect my mount here. As you can see, it looks like it might have been on there a little bit crooked. As you can see, it's some thick spots and then some really thin spots. So that kind of makes me feel like it might have been a little bit crooked, which are all things that you have to think about and be cognizant of when it comes to mounting your coolers. But it's not going to matter in the future as I go direct die. We're going to kind of be all over the place in this particular video because there's like 3 different things I want to talk about here. The first thing I want to talk about is how they are getting AM4 compatibility. To be compatible with an AM4 cooler, there's 2 things that have to be correct. One, obviously has to be able to have the same hole mounting. So if we look at the bottom of this motherboard, you can see it is using the AM4/AM5 retention bracket on the back. And I say AM4, AM5/AM4/AM5 because it's not exactly the same. Let me get an AM4 motherboard to show you. So this is a Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard. And if you remember, the default mounting mechanism for AM3 and AM4 is this kind of a hook system. Now, by default, this motherboard does have that hook system, by the way. I have it removed because the particular cooler that I was using has the little standoffs that screw down onto the back plate. You can see it's got the same little through hole right there, and this is just designed to screw down on that. I prefer to have a 4-point mounting mechanism like this because I feel like it can give you better tension on the die, or excuse me, the IHS. And I feel like the double clip system in the middle right here allows it to kind of rock weird, depending if you have tubes that are pulling on it, if you're going AIO or whatever. I don't like this method. So what I always do is I find methods that coolers that allow me to take that off. Now here's the thing. Once you start getting into water cooling, and a lot of air coolers too, and in fact over here if you look, we do have some samples that we're going to be testing here. We got a couple of a Be Quiet air cooler, a Be Quiet AIO, 2 different Noctuas. This is a sample. A lot of these particular coolers have their own backplate. So as you can see right here, my Impact doesn't even have one mounted at all, like no backplate and no retention system at all, because of the fact that clearly whatever cooler I used on here last uses its own, and I lose those brackets all the time, and that's why they're not on there. What I did with this guy actually is I was smart with the AM5. I took the parts off, put them in a Ziploc baggie, and I put them back in the motherboard box. You know, like somebody who's organized would do. But anyway, that's kind of besides the point. We're moving on to a different topic there, which we will get into in this video. But to be AM4 compatible, the new motherboard has to have the same mounting points, which it does. It does have these same brackets right here, although they're a little bit different. So like this from this motherboard, bringing it over to an AM4, based on what we're seeing on the Z-axis height, is different. So these were mounted on there, right down on the motherboard, and there's the screws and stuff on there. So I took them off. But it has to have the same mechanism, and then the same hooks have to be at the same height. But more importantly, whatever height they've chose to put the socket has to be at the same height. And PGA, or pin grid array CPU, which is all the AMD CPUs up to Ryzen 5000 series. So the height has to be the same, and then the holes have to be the same theoretically, and then the hooks have to be in the same spot. The only thing that actually makes AM5, AM4 compatible is if you're using a cooler that has the hooks. If you're using a cooler that does not retain the original backplate, you undo the 4 screws, you pull off the 2 brackets, you pull the backplate off, but you can't. And this is exactly what DeBauer was talking about, because these 4 screws right here, these Torx bit screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, which are very similar to Intel's, screw into that bracket right there, right there, right there, and right there. So that bracket is actually being held on with 8 mounting points. 4 of them are on the little, hook mounts, and then 4 of them are on the socket. So what he was having to manufacture is a replacement hold down mechanism for the CPU. It's kind of nuts, because what you'll get here, if I was to take this off, you've got to be careful with AMD now, just like Intel. Ooh. See, I do hate dealing with LGA, I really do. Look at all those pins. But if I were to take the CPU off, set that aside, and then undo those 4 screws, you're just left with this little tray that has all the pins in there. Because you cannot remove that bracket on the back without also taking away the mount for the CPU hold down retention, or the lever system, that means coolers are not going to be universally applicable with AM5 just because they say it's compatible with AM4 coolers. So AMD was not very forthcoming with the information of saying it's compatible with AM4 coolers asterisk, because of the fact that it has to be the coolers that use the hooks and the hooks only. Now, a lot of manufacturers recognize the hook mechanism is not the best hold down solution or the safest hold down solution. It takes a lot of tension to get those hooks down on there. Now, AIOs that have the hooks, they're not that bad because you can loosen up the screw, get them hooked on, and then tighten the screw down. But if you're using like any of the old style coolers where it was intended for you to take a flathead screwdriver and like slot it in there and push it down, just ask Phil about how he basically shaved a whole layer of SMDs right off his motherboard when he was younger because it slipped. I'm sure somebody in the video's comments right now has experienced that with the older cooler design. And
also shows you how long they've been using it, because like that was an Athlon XP.
Yeah, and then AM2, I believe, used it, and AM3 and all that stuff. So that mounting mechanism aside, why are the temperatures so high with AM5? Well, remember that Z-axis thing I said? It has to be at the same plane. And the reason for that is a lot of these coolers, and again, we'll get into looking at the coolers, some of these may work, some may not, they may all work, but I know for a fact not all of them do, because I experienced trying to mount a cooler to it that has its own backplate. Rule of thumb, if it has its own backplate, similar to like how this Corsair one is, if you have to replace the backplate with an AMD one, it won't work with AM5, period, end of story. Side note, AMD is aware of this and they say they are coming out with a bracket. The problem is it's not out yet. It will not be available for anyone on day one. And a lot of the coolers companies have not gone through and actually updated a lot of their material to say whether or not it is truly compatible with AM5 yet. So it's gonna be one of those, like, your guess is as good as ours on exactly which coolers are compatible, because you have a lot of different mounting mechanisms out there. But back to what I was saying, because I get sidetracked a lot, and it's ADHD and that's just what happens. What? So rather than like shimming the socket or making the socket height a certain spot or just kind of predetermining where all of that was gonna line up. The way AMD sort of approached it is they just went, let's just make the IHS thickness as thick as it needs to be at the Z-axis height of Ryzen 5000 and below or AM4 sockets. That is nearly 2 millimeters thicker than the IHS found on AM4 CPUs. I can't begin to tell you how much resistance there is in an integrated heat spreader that is nearly 2 millimeters thicker in terms of thermal conductivity and efficiency. It's significant. Sure, they went with soldered, which is good because we all know what happens, especially with Ask Intel, what happens when you use thermal interface material that's not solder based in between an IHS and the die. But what happens when that die, that integrated heat spreader is just thicker and thicker and thicker? De Bauer on direct die cooling, I'll get it. But even though he was using liquid metal, which he was saying like, hey, our results are not attributed to just liquid metal. It's just an opportunity. If you're doing direct die, you might as well use it. He said it was accounting for about 2C, at the most 3C of the cooling. He dropped up to 21C cooler with the stock voltage. That led to higher core clocks at stock voltage at up to 21C drop. And that's attributed directly to the super thick IHS. And the reason why I bring up the super thick IHS is if you look at the CPU, I thought, well, there's no way that the IHS is actually that thick. It's got to maybe be a box. I thought it was just gonna be a box. I know all IHSs are a box to some degree because it has to make up for the height of the die. But this one's like a big ass box, okay? So you can absolutely bet. Remember, I said I'm gonna go with the 7950X in my new build, even though I just never did the 12th gen. I never took it home because I was just like, I feel dirty taking it home. I will be doing direct die for multiple reasons. One, the mounting mechanism system that he's developing to go with it takes care of all of the Z-axis height issues. Comes with the mounting mechanism on the back and everything to hold the socket retention down, because you gotta hold the CPU substrate down somehow, which is this mechanism here. You don't wanna rely on passing through and just having the cooler hold it down, kind of like the Xeon mechanism for like servers and stuff. It's just not as safe that way. But just for the sake of knowing now, okay, sure, it can thermally handle 95C, but we're now seeing it doesn't have to. There is never, I say never with like 3 asterisks. There is it can be too cold. Ask liquid nitrogen folks. But there's never a such thing as too good of a cooler in a conventional application. Period. End of story. No discussion, no argument. Shut up if you're arguing because you're wrong. There's no such thing as it being too cool in getting it down as far below TJ Max, as close to ambient as possible. So, okay, now that you understand the Z-axis height and how AMD addressed it by making the IHS thickness match rather than actually making the substrate thickness or whatever having anything to do with it, you now know that if it uses a backplate replacement of any sort, it's not gonna work because the socket hold down mechanism bolts directly to that. Like if we look here, look, there's no holes there. See, on the standard AM4 one? Look at the AM5 one. You can see the extra 4 holes in the middle of the bracket. That's what it's holding down is the socket retention system. So that's obviously a problem. Let's just go ahead and do a little sampling right here. All we wanna do is we're not gonna mount them up. We are just gonna look at which mechanism are they using. And if these end up working, great. But if they don't, we'll take a look at some other brands to see what we got here. So we already know this right here is actually the Intel hold down mechanism for the Corsair CPU block. In fact, this is actually from my block right here. That's why it's this nice kind of a Cerakote black. I can't remember if my block actually uses that hold down. We'll have to check, I guess. I was telling people AMD said AM4 blocks would be compatible, but we're learning a lot of no EK blocks will because they use their own backplate. All right, this is the Noctua Nhu12a, very common mainstream CPU cooler. People love it because of the fact that it is all black. And I can tell you right now, this won't work. Why? Because it uses this method. It replaces the standoffs themselves. So let's test it real quick. So you do the same thing on the other side, and then on the CPU, there's a crossbar, or the cooler, there's a crossbar, and that's what you screw down using the little nuts. So as you can see, Nhu12a, pass. The NHD15 is not gonna work. So this is an older one. When was this manufactured? No AM4 mention on this. That shows you how old this cooler is. We haven't even had this one all that long, have we? And the reason why this isn't gonna work is simply because of the fact that you saw how on the other Noctua, it used the long way brackets. This one uses the sideways brackets. AM4 is wider than AM3. So as you can see, it's pretty far off. That's because the AM3 holes are that much narrower. And check this out. So if you take a look at the holes, actually it'd be easier if you look at the back. They just did it on the diagonals. And this one, the dark might be the same. You see how that has the diagonal? So that's how they gave compatibility on this board. Noctua NH-D15, fail. Be quiet.
Okay.
No, seriously, be quiet, I'm trying to talk here. Okay, so the Be Quiet Pure Rock 2FX, that's what people think I am. Whatever, think that way, that's fine. Be Quiet is a very popular brand. There's no doubt about it. A lot of people use Be Quiet. But if we take a look at the mounting mechanism, which one are they using? Okay, we can already just call this one a pass. It is using the same hold down long ways. And then the way it mounts, because I know some people were just really curious about that, is this little crossbar is what screws down onto there. Actually, it goes that way. And then that just holds the cooler down. Be Quiet Pure Rock 2FX, validated. So this is actually one of the minimum spec coolers I recommend with a 7950X if you're not gonna be doing any sort of voltage tuning or direct die cooling, which again, voids warranty. So I don't recommend people that don't want to void their warranty to do that. But this one, already validated. But instead of like the coolers, the air coolers, how it uses a long bracket. So instead of doing a sideways bracket, it does a long ways bracket, which is good because that gives you more clearance for your RAM. We all know what happens when things, especially tubes and all that, mounting mechanisms start getting too close to the RAM. Be Quiet Pure Loop 2FX, validated. Here's the biggest test. The Jay's 2 Cents collaboration block with Corsair. I realistically don't know how this is gonna go because I cannot remember what the mounting mechanism was like for AMD, because when I used it in my rig, it was Intel. And it was perfectly compatible with Intel because nothing's really changed with Intel except for the hole spacing since LGA 775. If you want one of these available, links are down below. I'll put all the purchase links so you guys can go and buy it. And yes, they are actually available on shelves at Micro Center. So if you live near a Micro Center, go get it. Even if you don't want to use it, just put it on your shelf. Oh, I think we're good. So it comes pre-installed with, look at that. Even has my logo in the thermal paste. That's worth 2C right there. I forgot that I was very adamant about not using the clips. We actually had a lot of discussion about this bracket. And you'll notice this bracket in terms of color and all that was very different than their other CPU blocks. It's all self-retained. Because one of the things I hated having to do was mount stuff and mount stuff and mount stuff. So all you have to do to make the AMD block work, I don't want to mess up the thermal paste. So there's an example of the block being installed. Water block. Validated? In fact, Phil even just commented how my water block was the easiest install of everything so far. Yeah, because you can take the Intel one off, which again, pre-installed. Take this one, mount it on in the orientation you want it to be. There you go. And mount it down. So this kind of wraps up today's video about things you need to know regarding the AM4, AM5 compatibility. We know that the temperatures suck because the IHS is so thick. That's probably why they had to raise the headroom, honestly, of the CPU, TJ Max, because they had to account for that extra thickness just being inefficient and causing the temperatures to go up. It's not hurting the CPU, and that's what TJ Max is, by the way. It's thermal junction max. It says that's the number at which the CPU cannot exceed under 24-hour load cases before damage will occur. Now, that's also like saying if your red line on your engine is 7,000 RPM, well, you can run it at 6,900 RPM constantly all day, every day, and it won't cause damage and wear and tear to the engine. That's simply not true. The thing is, CPUs are outlasting, even with degradation, their expected life cycles in terms of when people upgrade. So if it would have lasted 15 years and now it's lasting 12, most people would never know that. I'm not advocating for the temperature, saying it's not, in my opinion, too high. But now seeing how the direct die cooling, which is always better and more efficient, I think what I would love to see is if Der Bauer I'd love to see another test. Der Bauer, please watch this part and maybe I'll email you. Take a piece of material that's very similar to the IHS thickness of standard Ryzen and place that in between your thermal, or your die and your direct cooler, can we add that thickness in between and see what happens to the cooling? Because that would tell you then, if it had the same IHS thickness as Ryzen, the 5000 series and below, would the temperatures have been as bad? Because that's the only way we'd be able to validate that. So I'm really curious now, once you add that material between, what the numbers would be. Direct dye is always the most efficient, but I want to know what it would be as if you were to stick a piece of the same material, same thickness as a standard IHS between. But there you go. So the too long didn't watch version, if your cooler requires a back plate replacement, which is just about every single water block on the market for open air or open loop cooling, especially EK, except for mine. No, EK for the most part is like kind of out until they come up with the bracket. But EK is aware of that, and they are going to be coming out with a bracket that presumably is just going to have the 4 holes that allow the mounting down of the socket. And then they'll have the spacing there for the substrate on the back and all the dies and stuff to not impact that. Maybe EK really should just come up with a mounting mechanism that stops using their own bracket and just uses the 4 posts that are already there. My opinion, but you know, EK hasn't cared about my opinion in a long time. If it uses a custom backplate on the back, it won't work. Any other kind that uses the hardware that mounts to the existing posts or the clip type will work just fine. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope this educated you and keeps you from maybe making a mistake or having to wait for someone to come up with a fix for the mistake. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one.